Support for The Nocturnist comes from the California Medical Association.
At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
You're listening to The Nocturnist Conversations. I'm Emily Silverman. What does it mean to push your own limits? Can we make art out of failure? How do we think about the balance between light and shadow, presence and absence? These are just a few of the questions that our next guest has been thinking about for a long time. He's an emergency medicine physician who suffered a spinal cord injury while surfing a few years ago and used painting to aid in, but also to document, his recovery. His name is Matthew Wetschler, and I heard him speak at a retreat a few months ago, and as you'll hear in the interview, knew right away that I had to have him on the show to talk about his paintings, which are really more like performance art pieces. In addition to being a doctor and an artist, Matthew is the CEO of a digital health company called Plume, which offers world-class healthcare to transgender people. Matthew and I cover a lot of ground in this interview. But before we dive in, I want to play an audio clip from the short film Resurrection Artist, which documents Matthew's near-death experience and recovery. Let's roll the clip.
I woke up floating in the ocean. I couldn't move. With the last remaining air in my lungs, I screamed into the ocean. I probably had been dead for about 10 minutes. While body surfing, I'd hit my head and I'd fractured my neck and injured my spinal cord. I was an artist, a surfer, and a medical doctor. Even before this, I sought out challenging experiences. What's going to happen with my body? Will I go back to practicing medicine? Will I get back in the water? I don't know what's next.
I am sitting here with Matthew Wetschler. Matthew, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks, Emily. It's good to see you again, and I really appreciate you inviting me to join you.
So Matthew, I think I told you this, but I heard about you and your story before we met at the Theravada retreat, which for the audience was this wonderful physician well-being retreat that we went on. But I didn't put two and two together until I saw you sitting up there on this panel, and then you launched into your story, and my mind just exploded twofold. One, because I was like, oh, that's that guy that I've heard about. And then two, the stuff that you were saying was just so deep and profound. And you just like casually dropped all these truth bombs. So anyway, I was like, I have to get Matthew onto the podcast. So I'm so glad you're here.
Can I just keep that so I can hype myself up sometime when I'm not feeling so deep and profound? It's good. No pressure. All right, let's do it. Let the profundity begin.
You are a physician. Tell us about your path to medicine and your physician life before the accident.
Yeah, so I had a non-traditional path. It's actually an art and philosophy major. I'd never taken a science class in my entire life, except for maybe geology. And my dad was a doctor, and so I actually didn't want to be a doctor. After college, I hopped in a car and drove across the country. I lived in Wyoming for several years, and I lived in the mountains and was living out of the back of a car, or living out of a hostel, and generally just being in the mountains and being in nature. And that's always been something extremely important to me. But about 3 years in, I had an injury, nothing too crazy, just blew out a knee, but it was enough for me to pause and break the momentum of the life I was living then. And funny enough, I was at that time working as a maid in a hostel, and my coworker was this radical anarchist and handed me this book on anarchy. And there's a lot that you can take with a grain of salt, but one of the fundamental principles that's always stuck with me is the major capital of one's life is one's own time, and that it's fine however you spend it. What's most important is that you spend it intentionally. And at that time, I was very serious about athletics and then this injury. And after that, I went back into my art. I was painting. I ran an art nonprofit and started doing a lot of volunteerism. Got back into philosophy, was reading a lot of Eastern philosophy and these principles of selfless compassion, and never one to go halfway. I met a woman in an elevator, and a 2-minute conversation turned into a 3-hour conversation. The next thing you know, I was living in the slums of New Delhi for nearly a year, working with women and children, and decided there that I wanted to find a career that had at its core a sense of service. And medicine seemed compelling. I had a lot of exposure to it. But I've met so many people that have the destiny narrative of medicine. Like I knew since I was 8, I'm not that person. I found it slowly over time, and it was less of a passionate decision and one that seemed aligned with a lot of my values. And so I cut my stay short, and I had to start from scratch with a post-bac and went into medical school.
And you pop out the other side of your medical training more equal or less excited about medicine as you were when you went in?
I would say that I had a passion for the medical field. I had a great degree of ambivalence around the practice of clinical medicine, not because I had lost a passion, but because I found a significant amount of conflict between my values and a lot of the circumstances that I was placed in trying to practice medicine within a larger system. And I had actually felt that pretty early on, even second year of medical school. I just saw that how systems were designed, how medicine is paid for drastically shapes how patients and clinicians experience the clinical interaction. And I actually took a year away. I did a master's in public health, focused on technology, new models of care, entrepreneurship, and really from those early days had a firm commitment that I wanted to do something to change how the system of medicine was organized, even in a small way, like even in a small corner. And that's what really continued to inspire me. But I'm sure everybody that practices clinically knows, like some days are good and some days are really hard, and the system can be very challenging to operate in full time.
And when you had your accident in 2017, were you an attending, and what kind of medicine were you practicing?
Yeah, so I was board certified emergency medicine, and I wasn't attending. I'd been working mostly as a locums doc, traveling to rural hospitals, but then had just actually started full time down at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center in the Bay Area, which is one of the hospitals I trained at. It was the county hospital, which is sort of my flavor. I loved that style of medicine and that patient population. And I had actually worked just a few shifts as an attending in the hospital before I got injured. And then funny enough, that's where I did my rehab. So just full spectrum engagement with Santa Clara Valley Medical Center.
I want to hear about the accident, but before we get into that, what kind of art were you doing before the accident? Were you a painter, and how were you thinking about that part of your life and it fitting into medicine or not fitting into medicine?
I've been painting since I was 12, and it's always been an expression of what has been going on in my life. I'm not a realistic painter. I don't do portraits. I do a lot of abstract and conceptual work. And when I was in college, I was doing art and philosophy. And so a lot of my artwork were visual interpretations of philosophical principles that I had been studying. And then when I was in Wyoming, my painting had reference to the natural world, which was pretty central to where I was spending my energy. And then nearing my last year of residency, I actually got to a pretty dark place. And I think now it's increasingly common to talk about burnout and depression. And I definitely experienced that to the point that I needed to take some time away. It just was not well. After just getting out of the grind of training, realized that what I hadn't done in nearly 10 years was make art. Since I started medical training, it's something that I just kind of tucked away and ignored. And that was just always so important to me. And so during my time off, I actually got a studio again. I started painted, I think, 50 hours a week for several months. And that was, again, abstract work, very related to my experiences in medicine. A lot were like textural landscapes that looked like human tissue almost. It was not pretty, but it was provocative. I think it reflected some of the challenges and, as I mentioned before, this degree of ambivalence I was having with my experience with the medical system. And at the end of that, I had put together a show and I ended up selling pretty much all of my work, which was a pleasant surprise, not something I expected. But I came away from that experience with a recognition that's like, okay, one, this is extremely important to me, and I just can't ignore that. And the other is, this is something that I actually can do quite well. And I would love to have this as a part of my, not just as a hobby, but as a professional identity.
We've had a lot of book authors on the podcast. We recently had a ballerina who talked about dance and movement in medicine. We've had a couple of documentary filmmakers. You are our first painter. So why painting? What do you love about painting?
I would say that painting has some probably preconceptions that might come up in people's minds of what does a painting look like? Is it representative? Is it a landscape? Is it a portrait, etc.? And we'll go into it later, I'm sure, just these concepts of physical limitation. And the way that it's ultimately captured is through paint. I guess I do like the fluidity of the medium. I think it's quite responsive. It's very flexible. Sculpture is just a bit more methodical, or it can take much longer. And painting has this balance of the ability to be improvisational, yet also you can create a lot of textures and physical qualities that give it a sense of gravitas and weight and substance. And it has an interplay with light that I think is quite beautiful. And I can't sing a note, so music's out.
I want to talk about the accident, and I'm conscious of the fact that this is a story you've probably told hundreds, if not thousands of times, and we heard a little bit about the accident in the opening audio clip. So I'm not sure whether to ask you to just briefly tell us about the accident, or if I should ask it in a more meta way, which is like, how do you think about telling the story about the accident? So maybe I'll leave it up to you how you want to answer.
I have told it a lot of times. In some ways, I guess it's just a bit matter of fact now. There isn't really a lot of emotional resonance with it. I'm fortunate to have a lot of distance between me and that time. But even just saying the cold, hard facts, it just makes you think. I was swimming out there. The ocean was relatively empty. I must have hit my head, but I did wake up face down, completely paralyzed, and ended up drowning. And then my heart had stopped, and somebody just randomly found me in the water, pulled me ashore. And the first two people that found me were a ICU nurse and a resident, which, got very lucky. And yeah, picture perfect CPR. So by the time the ambulance got there, I had a heartbeat again. Basically had a decompressive laminectomy, pretty much C2 to C5. Within hours. And I'd say that in telling the story, what's interesting is what I have found is that story is a canvas upon which people can place their own ways of making meaning in the world. I mean, that story could be evidence of divinity. And it's like I've had people tell me that it's God's plan, and I'm not a religious person. To others, it could be a humanistic story of the belief of the ability of each of our capacity to do something for others. I was very dead looking, but I had multiple people just step out of whatever their routine was and into my life. And that's why I'm here. Or you could also say it's a story of the capacity of science. I'm actually patient zero in a post-operative care study around intrathecal pressure management using a delta between your art line and a sort of a live feed of intrathecal pressure within the spinal cord. And also I'm on the board of another study, which is now advocating for emergent, timely, decompressive surgeries for spinal cord injuries, much like you would do a craniotomy. The idea of the tissue swelling within a closed space causing ischemic damage is something that's well accepted as far as brain injury, but actually is still not as well accepted within the spinal cord injury community. My neurosurgeon, he's down at UCLA now, and this has been his thing that he's been advocating for a long time.
And before the accident, you were a highly intelligent, creative, thoughtful guy. You're creating paintings that correspond with different philosophical frameworks. And so I'm wondering, when you take somebody like that and you put them through a near-death experience and then they wake up, do you wake up with that philosophical lens of like, this has happened to me, what does this mean? Or do you wake up with a like, holy fuck, does all of that go out the window? What was that like?
People often ask how you change when you go through a really life-altering injury. And I think what's surprising is not how much you change, but how little you change. That you, and this is almost rote wisdom, like you are who you are where you are. Like, you know, if you've got that friend that's got issues and they're like, I'm moving to another city, and you're like, I don't know if that's probably not gonna, but if you need to, go for it. And it's kind of the same thing. You wake up as the same person. And I was paralyzed basically from the neck down. It was a full quad for a little while. And what I would say is that intellectual fire, that desire to be curious, to find personal edges to push, and also to self-express, it was just as potent as ever. And then the challenge became, what's the way that this energy can get out? Because it can't take the same shape anymore. You have to find a different conduit to express that energy. When crisis does find us, which it will, because things break and people die and life is impermanent, you fall back on what you have made habits of. I was a longtime competitive athlete, and I've, again, always been a creative and generative individual as far as what feels right for my mind and like what feels really satisfying. And those were two facets of my personality that became extremely important to me.
And the paint and canvas came into the hospital room. So it sounds like the decision happened pretty early on that you wanted to paint. Walk me through that thought process. Did you already know what type of painting you wanted to do, and how did that all happen?
I wanted to find a way to express my experience, and I was struggling to find some medium to do so. Art making seemed to be a place where you can be unstructured, and any type of mark making can be art making depending on the intention. And it was very interesting to me that pretty much from the moment I woke up, I just felt so compelled to lean into my artistic practice, to make that a part of my experience and a part of recording my experience. I would say the other thing that art did for me at that time was help me keep a sense of identity. And I think this speaks back to practicing medicine, especially in an inpatient environment. It seeks to homogenize us, and it seeks to strip us of our own personal narratives. We're all put in scrubs, both patients and clinicians. We are in rooms that are identical. And we've been on the clinical side. We'll go so far as to not even call people by their name. We'll just refer to them by their diagnosis, like what's going on with pancreatitis and 204. And you can feel that as a patient. You can feel yourself being abstracted from your story of like who you are, what type of life experiences brought you to where you are. I loved being covered in paint. I have these painting pans that just have like colors all over them. I dry my brushes on them, and they're very they're very conspicuous. They're just like, obviously some sort of like art thing was going on. It looks like paint exploded on me, and I would just roll around in these pants. And what it meant for me is it was this refusal to be completely separated from who I was outside of the hospital and who I was outside of my injury.
You said you were quadriplegic for a while. So walk us through the mechanics of how you painted.
Fortunately, I was at ASIA D, which is the lowest grade of spinal cord injury. It's incomplete. Just to be clear for people listening or not familiar with the ASIA scoring system, my prognosis was good. It was expected that I would have a good recovery and a good outcome. So this isn't a situation where I was like never going to walk again and something crazy happened. But the pace at which it did, I think, was remarkable. I was able to basically walk again within several months, which is less common. But getting into about 4 weeks in, some limb movement started to come back, mostly at the kind of hip and shoulder girdle, like more proximal joints. And initially I was working with a art therapist who would prop up my arm and I would move it around and we would do this in tandem. And at that point I was doing this series where basically I was just trying to use materials around me. And so I used syringes, catheters, iodine, pretty much anything that was involved in my daily care and using that to make textures and make images and trying to have this porosity between what my daily lived experience was and these pieces of art I was making, which were kind of in some ways artifacts of this experience. Then from there, I had this idea to start doing rituals on a regular cadence to explore and capture visually what my current state of limitation or ability was. And so the first painting I did in this kind of series, it was the same framing, just a single brush stroke, no assistance, no stopping, just one kind of expressive stroke. And I did that every week for nearly 6 months. And so it created quite a few canvases. And, that was basically a journal of my body regaining strength. And from there, really what my art is now, which I've been doing for the last 5 years, came from that, just all these different ways of exploring and finding personal limitations.
You mentioned personal limitations earlier, and I imagine that as an athlete, that was important to you. As an artist, as a physician, as a recovering patient. Talk about this impulse to find one's personal limitations. Where does that impulse come from? Why is that good?
I think that the most personal growth comes from when we step into liminal spaces and exist in discomfort. And probably one of the most important disciplines we can have as individuals is learning how to be comfortable in discomfort. I feel like that's when I'm most alive. To me, it's like what living is. And it's what I respect most in others, people that operate at the edge of their capacity and push themselves. Perhaps that comes from a athletic background. I mean, I was a rower, which is basically pulling on a stick until you pass out. It's very unforgiving. There's basically no technique, and it's just a complete sufferfest. Not sure if that's what created my mentality or my mentality just worked well with that sport. But I've always just found satisfaction in exploring those personal edges. And I feel like that's where we grow. And I think anybody can do that reality check. When's the last time you shifted your own perspective without major crisis? It is discomfort that causes us to grow and evolve and become better, whatever better is. It could be physically stronger, or it could be emotionally aware, or it could be more self-compassionate. I won't say it's always pretty, but it's how I've approached life and it's how I approached my injury, and still with me now.
When I heard you speak on the panel at Theravada, you said something about reaching for the edge or the contour and how that is the ingredients for form and how that is the starting point for beauty. And so I may not be remembering that exactly right, but I think that was the moment where my brain kind of exploded. So what's the connection between limitations and form and beauty?
I think we falsely believe that the lack of limitations is a precondition for happiness. That one can make it a case that it's like a capitalistic assumption, that more choice is better, that the ideal state is one without limitation, without hardship. And I think that's completely a lie and a false pursuit. To me, that phrase, what is like a meditation on disability or becoming differently abled. And all of us will encounter that at some point. Basically, I have conversations that really resonate with people in their 70s. I can talk about my bum knee. So we're all going to find it at some point, having like a very fundamental change in your capacity in some way or another. You realize that the ways that you can express your energy in the world are not unbounded, they are constrained. But that is not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't preclude you from doing something of real meaning and value in the world, whether for yourself, for the people you care about, more broadly, for society. But it does change the shape. And so this idea that limitation is like boundaries. Boundaries are preconditions for form, and form is precondition for beauty. And I think that we have the ability, regardless of our circumstances, to find beauty and to express ourselves in ways that can be personally fulfilling. And what we distract ourselves with is a excessive weighting on our external circumstances or our current context. Now, I mean, there's edge cases. If you're in prison, it can be tough, but just generally speaking, I think a lot of us fall into a framework where like, okay, well, my happiness is based on some delicate house of cards of external circumstances of like job, money, career aspiration, whatever it is, relationship. And sometimes all that stuff just gets swept away. And what that showed me is how independent one's sense of happiness can be from those external circumstances. So that's a little bit of a tangent, a little bit meandering into some other thoughts around this, but I think it's connected.
In the photos and the videos, we see you with, I think it's a weight hanging from your wrist, and you're like trying to hold up the paintbrush, and you're holding it up as long as you can, and then it's like your arm falls down, and then the mark that is made, it's on this like very white, gushy canvas with thick layers of paint. It almost looks like plaster. Are those the types of paintings that you were making later as you recovered? And is that still the types of paintings that you're making?
Exactly. Yeah. Since my injury, I've only painted in all white, I think for nearly 5 years now. And you described it quite well. It's this very thick, almost plaster-like medium. And I don't apply paint. I actually pull paint out. I gouge. It's like gouging away from the surface of the painting. And I would use weights. And so my right arm is my most affected by my injury. It's the weakest. And so I would put weight around this arm and use the weight to essentially induce failure. And then use the process of failure, of like physical failure, as a mark making tool, and kind of like exploring the edge of personal capacity, of physical capacity, as a way of making a pattern on the canvas. And so when you actually view the painting, what you're not viewing is paint applied. You're viewing the absence of something. You're viewing these empty spaces left by where the marks were made. And because it's all white, because it's monochrome, you really don't even pick up lines based on the colors or patterns. You're able to perceive the painting because of shadows. It actually looks quite differently when it's lit tangentially. And to like further that kind of conceptual framework, what you're really perceiving is the absence of light. And so everything about the art that I do is this meditation on the tension between presence and absence.
It sounds like your injury / recovery has stabilized in a way. So are you having to find new ways to express those limitations, different weights, different ways of painting? Have you had to evolve your methods as your body reached a new baseline?
Where I want to go next is becoming progressively more full body as everything's become online, and I've been exploring more archetypal rituals that are common across cultures as a ways of starting to frame these. Ultimately, they're like performance pieces, and they interrelate to a lot of performance art and what's also known as action art. It came out of the 40s, 50s. It's post-surrealist movement. And Jackson Pollock was one of the first to really put the canvas on the ground, step onto the canvas, and use this kind of like more energetic physical way of interacting. And there's others like the Fluxus movement in Europe and the Gutai movement in Japan were all exploring similar themes at similar times. And then you had a lot of durational art. This is mostly around line drawing. You'll see people that draw circles till failure, or will jump or leap or fall and trace lines on a wall. And it's all sort of in that lineage. And for me now, I would say an example of where I would want to take my art is I did one piece called Reentry, where I took this canvas out. It was like 4 foot by 8 foot and coated in this plaster, and then brought it out to the section of the beach out in San Francisco where I had died. And it was the first time I touched the water since my injury. And I walked in these very large circles and did somewhat of a baptism ritual. And then between every cycle of this ritual, I would lay down on the canvas and make a mark, and did that 13 times. And it was very cold, and the body starts to break down in different ways as it's San Francisco in the fall, and it's not balmy, and capturing that ritual in an artifact. And so those are where I would like to push my art, into these like larger format, more full body pieces.
A lot of your work is focused on expanding and expressing and pushing against limits. It's a very like outward energy. And I'm wondering, do you ever get exhausted? And is there ever a time to pull back, retract, turn inward? I'm almost thinking just about the breath, like inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. How do you think about that? How do you rest and restore in between these like expansion events?
The type of art I make is not personally replenishing. It's actually quite exhausting physically, but also even mentally. I work quite hard. I research a lot. And I feel like now I've gotten to a point where I can articulate quite clearly some of the concepts that I've been exploring, but that's been a result of a lot of work and a lot of introspection. And I think for me, great art, you're sort of in dialogue between the creator and the object being created. It's like you do something that is partially intentional, partially improvisational or intuitive, and then you sit with this object and you're like, what's that all about? There's something here. What is it? And I think for me, it's what does it mean? And so I found it can be quite exhausting. I would say that I really respect artists that can just continually create, and have friends that are full-time professional artists, and seeing the degree to which they can be continuously generative is something I respect very deeply, and also know that I can't match. And so I've learned over the years, and perhaps those that have their own creative pursuits and maybe they feel dormant right now because of where they are in their training, it's okay. Like these things ebb and flow, and you don't become less creative because you're not always expressing it. That those pullback moments can be fine and also can inform your art later. You also just have to experience life. I think for me, at least, so much of what I put into my art is related to personal experiences. It's getting out and just experiencing things, and living can be fuel for another round, another push of creative energy. I also tend to work very intensely. Like I'm fully on or fully off. And so I'm either in the studio like 60, 80 hours a week, or I just don't touch it. It's very difficult for me to be balanced about it.
How are you thinking about being a doctor? Are you still a doctor? What does that mean? And how is that all shaking out?
I think the answer to that pivots into something else that's very important to me that we haven't really talked about, is what I'm doing now as I'm running a company. So just a quick plug. Company is Splume. We're the first digital health platform for the transgender community. And we provide gender affirming hormone therapy through a fully virtual care model. We're now expanding into gender affirming virtual primary care and insurance reimbursement. We started about 3 years ago, and we're now the largest provider of transgender healthcare in the world, which has been exciting. My best friend from medical school is my co-founder, Jerica, and she came out as trans. And really right before we started the company, we've been on this journey together. And so I find entrepreneurship is an immensely creative activity. I mean, you're just pushing something novel out into the world and tackling unsolved and thorny problems day in, day out. And so that generative creative energy has definitely found a conduit in business building. Also, we're unique in that one of the few digital health companies that's started by two doctors. I don't practice currently, but I went through residency. I practiced as an attending, like I've been in the trenches. I definitely know some of the realities of what it's like to deliver healthcare. And I'm on the business side now. I'm the CEO, but I think that informs how we build our company, how we prioritize the experience of clinicians, how we focus ourselves on some of the ethics and principles of medical care. And for Jerica and I, it's a place where we were able to build a company around our values that brought us into medicine. And we've done it in such a way that we, for the last 3 years, really weren't beholden to trying to operate within a system. It's fully direct to consumer. And so we could build the system exactly how we wanted. And we built it really based on our lived experiences as clinicians and as patients.
For our healthcare audience, we have doctors and nurses and other types of healthcare professionals. We have medical students, we have residents and fellows, early career attendings, seasoned attendings. It runs the gamut. What message would you like to shout out to folks before we end?
I would say that what I experienced in my training is a fear of deviating from the path. That there is a sense of this tight, narrow line that you need to walk to become a doctor, to be successful. And your definition of what success is can become quite narrow to the point that it's very constraining. And it also can be quite taxing to one's own happiness. I took 4 months off at the end of residency. Like I was 1 year away. That was years deep, like a decade plus deep into training. And I stepped away. And to somebody that hasn't done clinical training, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But to those that have done residency, knowing that someone took 4 months off in their last year of residency, that's just crazy talk. And it felt crazy. It felt really crazy going through it. But at that point, I had realized that I'd set this expectation for myself, like my bar that I was trying to get to was just survival. And there was just some thought, I'm like, that is just sad. I should expect more from myself. I deserve to be healthy at the very least. And I refused to go back until I felt that way. And, and then I finished 6 months off of my peers. And I think if my life is an example of anything, is you can deviate from the path and like things still work out. It's why I think medical training is actually emotionally traumatic. It leaves us absent of key emotional tools that we need once there isn't the conveyor belt. And I think you see this a lot when people finish training. Many go through basically a huge existential crisis because they don't really have any experience defining what's meaningful for themselves. If you do not have the skills to introspect, to articulate your own personal values, then you will accept whatever the next definition of success is. And at that point, it's like productivity and money. And when you have then a bunch of clinicians, whether overtly or just reactively responding to the next brass ring, I think it starts to really pervert the medical environment. And it's like worse for patients. And that to me is like deeply sad.
And that's part of what we're working on here is actually what you said quite literally is helping people self-articulate. And our medium of choice rather than paint or plaster has been storytelling. And it's been so gratifying just to watch people find their voice again and again, because you can really feel that shift, that moment where the person discovers what it is that they're trying to say, or at least gets closer to it. And so that's really beautiful to watch. And in some ways, it's a very simple thing. And in other ways, it's a very radical thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's deeply meaningful. I mean, my path, like I deviated against my choice. I'm out in left field and you can still find a way. If some of my experiences can be a little like food for thought and be like, oh, wow, like maybe I can do something a little, a little off kilter here. And maybe a tool, I'll give it like a tool for people to use when they're thinking about decisions. And this comes from Annie Dukes, who wrote this book, Thinking in Bets. She was a psychology PhD turned professional poker player that lectures on decisional quality. And it's the 10-10-10 rule, which is what would you think of this like 10 days, 10 months, 10 years from now? And view your prospective choice retrospectively as your future self. And that's actually something that helped me gain the confidence to take time away from residency. So I was like, wow, this feels like a really big deal now. But 10 years from now, what will the story be? But like, yeah, I was in residency. I got to a dark place. I decided I needed to take some time, took a few months off. I finished a few months later and I became a doctor. That's it. And, and that's my story now. And I say that to most people. No one even blinks. It's literally a non-story to most people, but it felt so significant. I like lost so much sleep over making this choice. And so I would just encourage people, it's okay to step aside a little bit, to like get off the path. I mean, like I said, you can find a lot of ways to express your energy in the world and find things that are meaningful.
I think that's a beautiful way to end. Anything else you'd like to share?
No, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you allowing me to share my story in this space. I've admired what you've done with the Nocturnist for a long time. And so it's really a pleasure to be talking with you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I have been talking to Dr. Matthew Wetschler, emergency medicine physician, artist, athlete, CEO, and overall just amazing person. Thank you so much for being here and have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thanks for listening. This has been our final episode of 2022, so thank you for being with us. And if you've enjoyed anything you've heard on the show this year, I encourage you to visit our website at thenocturnist.com and click Donate. We are a small indie nonprofit organization, so every gift really counts, and we hope that you'll consider supporting us in your holiday giving. This episode of The Nocturnist Conversations was produced by Carly Besser and John Oliver, and edited and mixed by John Oliver. Our executive producer is Allie Block, and our chief operating officer is Rebecca Groves. Our original theme music was composed by Yosef Monroe, and any additional music is from Blue Dot Sessions. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure that the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. Our show is also made possible with donations from listeners like you. So, like I mentioned earlier, I encourage you to support us. If you enjoy listening to the show, please also leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help people find us. And last but not least, to contribute your voice to an upcoming project, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. Happy New Year.